Member for Leeds, Grenville, Thousand Islands, and Rideau Lakes.
Well, thank you, Speaker. It's an honor to rise this evening to let you know and let all members know, to let Canadians know that it's time to end the mandates. This issue is so much bigger than any one individual piece of pandemic restrictions that we've seen over the course of the last 2 years. It's bigger than any one hardship, but the collective hardships that Canadians have faced amount to so much. But the decisions that the government has made over this time, we've heard time and time again, have been grounded in science. And honorable members in this place are expected at all times to be honorable, to be honest, to not mislead this House, to be forthright. And so this evening, I'm going to give the Parliamentary Secretary the opportunity to tell Canadians what the government's plan is, on which date the government is going to end federal mandates. Because we know that every single one of the provinces has either ended their vax and mask mandates or has announced the date that they're going to do this. Every single one of them. Those decisions were made by the Chief Medical Officer of Health in each one of those provinces, guided by the science. So when we have 10 of the provinces, 10 Chief Medical Officers of Health, all agreeing that it is safe to lift those restrictions based on the science, well, the same should be true for the federal Chief Medical Officer of Health and for the federal government. But instead, those hardships that Canadians have faced over the last 2 years, they persist. Federal public servants who've been put out of work because of these restrictions, because of a medical choice. Some even received their first dose in a 2-dose series, had a reaction or weren't able to proceed with their second shot. Some weren't prepared to disclose their vaccination status to their employer. That's true for federal public servants, RCMP, members of the Canadian Forces. We know that Canadians have the strictest domestic travel regulations in the world. You can't take a plane to fly to visit an ailing loved one, to see the birth of a child, to mourn the passing of a family member or a close friend, if you don't check those boxes that the government has set out. The federal government, when the provinces have said that it's safe to waive those restrictions. Our tourism sector, businesses, incredibly hard hit. You know, speaking with members of the Frontier Duty Free Association, members in my riding and their representatives from across Canada, hearing about how they're at risk of losing their businesses and their homes because of these continued regulations. But the science says that it's safe to lift the restrictions. So while I look forward to the Parliamentary Secretary telling me the good things, the lives that have been saved, we all celebrate saved lives. But now we're at a point 2 years in where the science tells us it is safe. It's safe to lift those restrictions. We need to shift to a model of personal responsibility, like so many Canadians have done over the last 2 years, by following the rules, staying home, masking up, many getting vaccinated. But now that personal responsibility is theirs to bear, and we as a society are prepared to follow the science, to end the mask mandate, end the vax mandates, because that's what the science says. Thank you, Speaker.
Hear, hear. The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Public Safety.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I want to thank the Honourable Member for Leeds, Grenville, Thousand Islands and Rideau Lakes for his question about how we're handling our international borders. Mr. Speaker, I'd like to remind the Honourable Member that the Government of Canada announced new border measures that will take effect this Friday, April 1st. It's a step that so many Canadians have been waiting for, and great news for snowbirds who are keen to come home after spending the winter abroad. These new measures are due to the tenacity of citizens. So many Canadians, residents, foreign workers, truckers, healthcare workers, and many others have steadfastly worn masks, kept their distance, sanitized, and followed public health guidelines. They've postponed, as he mentioned, vacations, weddings, birthdays, and so much more. They've lined up to take not just one or two, but 3 vaccinations. They understand the value of coming together to protect our most vulnerable. I wish I could thank everyone who has been committed to these measures over the last 2 years. It's those sacrifices and their sense of community that allows us to transition this week to a new phase at the border. I know my honourable colleague will join me in offering our thanks here in the House of Commons through you, Mr. Speaker. Starting April 1st, fully vaccinated travellers will no longer need to provide recent COVID-19 test results in order to enter Canada by air, land, or water. Although boosters have shown to help Canadians avoid COVID, they are not necessary to qualify as fully vaccinated. Public safety remains at the forefront of all of our decision making. So while we no longer need all fully vaccinated travelers to be tested, some of them will be selected randomly for mandatory testing. Those who are selected will be glad to know they are not required to quarantine while waiting for their test results. To further safeguard Canadians, we will continue to require valid, accepted proof of pre-entry testing for travelers aged 5 and up who are not vaccinated or are only partially vaccinated. I'd like to remind our returning snowbirds and other travelers that regardless of how long they were away from Canada, we still need them to submit their information in ArriveCan before arriving in Canada, either using the free mobile app or printing their receipt from a computer. Mr. Speaker, if I may, I'd like to take this opportunity to thank Canadian Border Services Agency employees for their tireless work over the last 2 years. We will continue to move towards a more sustainable approach to the management of the COVID-19 pandemic. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Leeds, Grenville, Thousand Islands, Rideau Lakes.
Well, thank you to the Parliamentary Secretary for the response, and I echo her praise of our dedicated CBSA officers, including at the 2 ports of entry in my riding. But they, like other federal workers, and the union, PSAC, representing federal workers, is calling for an end to the unscientific mandate that's keeping their members, their employees, off the job. And the businesses along the border, like the duty-free shops that I mentioned before, they're suffering, unable to do their business. Those ones in particular, disproportionately hit hard by border restrictions, are just asking the government to follow the science and to lift the federal mandates, just like has been done in all of the provinces where each one of those ports of entry operate.
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Over the last few months, the Government of Canada has had to make adjustments to public health measures already in place at our borders in an effort to tackle the Omicron variant of COVID-19. Based on a number of factors, including Canada's high vaccination rates, the increasing availability and use of rapid tests to detect infection, hospitalization rates, and growing domestic availability of therapeutics and treatments, the Government of Canada is adjusting and will continue to adjust its border and travel measures. Canadians continue to be asked to please exercise caution while traveling abroad, understand the risks that are still associated with international travel, and take the necessary precautions. Rules and public health measures can change quickly. The Government of Canada will continue to enforce public health measures at the border in response to the evolving threat of COVID-19, and we will always protect Canadians. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
La motion portant que la Chambre s'adjourne est maintenant répétée.
The motion to adjourn the House is now deemed to have been adopted. Accordingly, this House stands adjourned until tomorrow at 2 p.m. pursuant to Standing Order 24-1.